How could the cradle of democracy, the city that gave us freedom of thought, sentence to death the man who redefined Western philosophy? Socrates, a name revered today, was considered so dangerous to Athens that he had to be silenced forever. But was he a victim of a corrupt system or a real threat to the Athenian way of life? Today you'll understand that the truth behind this trial goes far beyond what you learned in philosophy class. Socrates is one of the pillars of Western thought. His name is etched in history not only because of his ideas, but due to the lasting impact of his death. In 399 BC, the philosopher stood trial in Athens under charges that at first glance may seem trivial, corrupting the youth and disrespecting the city's gods. But what was truly at stake was much larger. Socrates lived during a turbulent time for Athens. The city, once an unbeatable power, had been defeated in the Peloponnesian War and was drowning in political and moral crisis. The celebrated democracy was weakened, and many citizens were searching for someone to blame for the decline. Socrates, with his uncomfortable questions and critiques of tradition, became the perfect target. But was his trial really about religious crimes, or was it a way to eliminate an inconvenient figure who challenged the elites and the status quo? Throughout this video, we'll explore the political tensions of the time, understand Socrates' defense strategy, which may have been more provocative than effective, and analyze whether his condemnation was inevitable. In the end, you'll decide. Did Socrates deserve the death sentence, or did Athens sacrifice its greatest thinker in the name of stability? Stay with us until the end to discover how this trial changed the world forever. Athens, the city that had once been the cultural and military center of Greece, now breathed uncertainty. The Peloponnesian War, 431–404 BC, had shattered its ambitions and left behind a trail of devastation, not just physical, but moral and political. The defeat by Sparta wasn't just a loss of territory or prestige. It was a blow to something much deeper, the pride of being Athenian. The people who had once led glorious victories now found themselves questioning their own institutions. The celebrated democracy seemed fragile, susceptible to internal betrayals. At the heart of this unstable environment was a question that echoed through the streets and agoras. Who was to blame for the city's collapse? To understand why Socrates became a target of this dissatisfaction, we need to go back to the period immediately after the war. With Athens defeated, the Spartans imposed the rule of the 30 tyrants, an oligarchic regime that persecuted opponents and established a reign of fear. This brief period was one of the darkest in Athenian history, marked by political executions and persecution. When democracy was restored, citizens didn't feel immediate relief. On the contrary, the wounds left by this internal conflict fueled a desire for justice, or in many cases, vengeance. But resentment wasn't directed solely at political figures. Athenian values were being called into question. Athenian culture was deeply rooted in religious traditions, honor, and respect for the laws of the polis. But the world was changing. Young Athenians began challenging old norms, inspired by intellectual figures who promoted debate and questioning, like Socrates. And that's when the suspicion began to grow. To many, he wasn't just a philosopher. He was a silent threat to order. Socrates wasn't exactly a man who could be easily ignored. He roamed the public squares, questioning politicians, poets, and ordinary citizens, challenging them to reflect on basic concepts like justice, virtue, and the meaning of life itself. Although he never wrote a single line, everything we know about him comes from the accounts of his disciples, such as Plato. His method of questioning was direct and unsettling. He didn't teach absolute truths. Instead, he dismantled people's certainties, exposing their contradictions. And in normal times, this might have been tolerated, even admired. But in the post-war context, where everything was seen as a potential threat to stability, Socrates was viewed as an intellectual arsonist. Another crucial aspect was Socrates' personal associations with unpopular political figures in Athens. One of his most famous former students was Critias, one of the leaders of the 30 tyrants, the same brutal regime that had terrorized Athens after the war. Although there's no evidence that Socrates shared Critias's extremist views, the mere fact that he had been his mentor was enough to raise suspicions. He was also connected to Alcibiades, a brilliant but notoriously unpredictable Athenian general known for his betrayals. To many, Socrates wasn't just an eccentric philosopher. He was the man who shaped dangerous minds. Social tensions were also running high. After the war, many ordinary citizens faced economic hardship, while the elites seemed to recover their privileges more quickly. Public frustration was palpable, and in times of crisis, the search for scapegoats becomes almost instinctive. Socrates, with his subversive ideas and rejection of traditional conventions, fit perfectly into the role of someone to be sacrificed for the collective good. It didn't help that he frequently questioned the city's gods, showing little reverence for the deities that had protected Athens since ancient times. To many, he wasn't just a man with strange ideas. He was a symbol of everything that had gone wrong. This climate of distrust, disillusionment, and fear shaped the backdrop of Socrates' trial. The official charges, corrupting the youth and introducing new deities, may seem superficial or even absurd from an outsider's perspective, but within Athens, these accusations carried symbolic weight. They reflected not just religious concerns, but political ones. After all, what did corrupting the youth mean in this context? To some, it meant inspiring them to believe that old traditions and leaders were not infallible. It meant planting the seed of questioning in a city that had already suffered enough from revolts and instability. Thus, Socrates' trial wasn't just about a man and his ideas. It was a reflection of the collective fear of a city struggling to rebuild itself. Athens couldn't tolerate more disorder, and to many, allowing Socrates to remain free was to risk his teachings sparking new crises. The irony is that, in trying to preserve stability, Athens eliminated the very person who might have offered deeper answers to the dilemmas it faced. But the question remains, was Socrates truly condemned for threatening the city's well-being, or was he merely a convenient target in the midst of a larger crisis? The answers to these questions begin to reveal themselves when we examine the charges in detail. Charges that, at their core, reveal more about Athens' fears and failures than about the man they tried to destroy. The charges against Socrates were not just a direct attack on his philosophy, but a manifestation of Athens' own dilemma. A city divided between preserving its traditions and dealing with a world in transformation. The first charge, corrupting the youth, may seem vague and even convenient, but in the context of the time it carried deep ideological weight. Socrates did not corrupt the youth in a direct way, as a modern interpretation of the accusation might suggest. He didn't incite them to commit crimes or disobey specific laws. His crime was far subtler and, for that reason, more threatening. He taught them to think for themselves, to question authority and tradition, something dangerous in a society still struggling to recover from the chaos of war. Many of the young men who followed Socrates were future leaders, members of the upper classes, who would one day influence the fate of Athens. The philosopher challenged conventional notions of justice, power, and morality, teaching through questions rather than providing answers. His Socratic method, in which he consistently exposed flaws and contradictions in others' beliefs, was both captivating and infuriating. To the Athenian elite, this type of teaching was seen as destabilizing. After all, if young men began doubting the traditions that upheld the polis, what would stop new rebellions from arising? The second charge, introducing new deities and failing to respect the city's gods, was not just a religious issue. In Athens, religion and politics were deeply intertwined. The gods protected the city, and religious rituals were also civic duties. By questioning traditional beliefs, Socrates seemed to imply that Athens' divine protection wasn't guaranteed. At a time of crisis, this attitude wasn't just seen as heresy. It was viewed as treason. However, Socrates' trial was far more than just an examination of the evidence against him. When Socrates stood before the court, he wasn't facing a modern tribunal but an assembly of 500 citizens, where rhetoric, persuasion, and emotion carried as much weight as facts. Many believed that if Socrates had taken a more humble and conciliatory approach, he could have been acquitted. But Socrates was not the type of man to soften his words for the sake of pleasing others. His defense recorded in works like Plato's Apology, serves as a testament to how he used the trial not to seek forgiveness, but to reaffirm his principles. He began his defense by challenging the legitimacy of the accusations and exposing the inconsistencies in the arguments of his accusers, including Miletus, Anytus, and Lycon. Almost provocatively, Socrates argued that far from corrupting the youth, he was helping them seek truth and avoid accepting things simply because they were tradition. The unexamined life is not worth living, he declared, making it clear that he would rather face death than abandon his role as a societal questioner. This heroic stance, however, may have been his greatest strategic mistake. His defiant attitude not only angered the judges, but reinforced the image of Socrates as a man who refused to conform to the city's norms. To many in the courtroom, he seemed to mock the seriousness of the trial, as if he already knew that his conviction was inevitable. When given the opportunity to propose an alternative punishment, a common practice in cases where the conviction wasn't unanimous, Socrates made a nearly comical suggestion: to be rewarded with free meals at the Prytaneum, the hall where the city's heroes were honored. To the judges, this was the final provocation, a sign that he didn't take the trial seriously. Socrates was fully aware that his stance was sealing his fate, but he seemed determined to turn the moment into a philosophical lesson for future generations. By challenging the court instead of pleading for mercy, he solidified his image as a martyr for truth and intellectual freedom. He was not a man who would live under the condition of denying his beliefs. As he himself stated, obeying the city would mean disobeying the divine mission that drove him to question everything and everyone. Truth was his compass, and he wouldn't abandon it, even with his life on the line. When the verdict of guilt was announced, the death sentence felt like an inevitable formality. But the question that lingers throughout history is, was the outcome of the trial truly determined by the evidence, or was Socrates already condemned the moment he chose to remain loyal to his method of questioning? In any case, by accepting his sentence with calm and refusing the chance to escape offered by his friends, he sealed his own legendary status. The court's verdict was final, but the impact of his condemnation didn't end with his death. What followed, how Athens tried to justify its decision, and how Socrates' image was reinterpreted over the centuries, raises the question of how much this trial reflected the internal failures of the city itself. After all, when a society silences its critical voices, it isn't solving its problems. It's merely delaying the inevitable. When the death sentence was announced, there was no surprise on Socrates' face. Unlike other condemned men, he didn't show despair, didn't beg for mercy, and didn't weep before his fate. On the contrary, he accepted the verdict with the serenity of someone who knew that his death wasn't just the end of a life, but the beginning of something far greater. He had been accused of corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods, but rather than defending himself like an ordinary man, he had turned the trial into a philosophical stage. Now, by accepting death without resistance, he completed his final lesson. Living with virtue also meant dying for it. The chosen method of execution was poisoning by hemlock, a bitter and deadly toxin commonly used for such sentences in Athens. Plato, in his work Phaedo, provides a touching account of Socrates' final moments. The philosopher, surrounded by his friends and disciples, discussing the soul, life, and immortality until his final breath. Socrates did not see death as a personal tragedy. To him, it was simply a passage, a liberation from the limitations of the physical body. A good man cannot be harmed either in life or in death, he reportedly said, reaffirming his belief that true virtue transcends the material world. This final act would profoundly shape subsequent philosophical thought. Socrates' death was interpreted as a sacrifice for truth and intellectual freedom, inspiring thinkers like Plato, who devoted much of his work to preserving and expanding his master's teachings. Plato saw Socrates' execution as proof that Athenian democracy had deep flaws. To him, the majority, when driven by emotion and fear, could be as tyrannical as a single despot. His disillusionment with the democratic system led him to develop his own ideas about the ideal political structure, advocating for the rule of the philosopher king, a leader guided by reason rather than the whims of the masses. Aristotle, Plato's student, was also influenced by Socrates' legacy, but took a different path, focusing on a more practical approach to ethics and politics. One way or another, Socrates' death didn't mark the end of his ideas, but rather served as the catalyst for their broader dissemination. While Athens tried to erase his name, his disciples transformed him into an eternal symbol. Socrates ceased to be merely a man and became an ideal, the embodiment of the intellectual who challenges authority and pays the ultimate price for it. But the question remains, was the trial and execution of Socrates truly just, or was he merely a scapegoat, a victim of a society in crisis that needed someone to bear the blame? Many modern scholars argue that Socrates was not condemned for the crimes he was accused of, but for what he represented. He was a threat to the established order, not because he sought to overthrow it through violence, but because he planted seeds of doubt at a time when Athens craved certainty. By exposing the intellectual and moral weaknesses of the city's leaders, he not only embarrassed them but also forced them to confront their own limitations. In times of stability, this might have been seen as healthy debate. But in times of crisis, when the city was struggling to recover from its defeat by Sparta, there was no room for deep questioning. The desire for unity and security outweighed the desire for self-reflection. Eliminating Socrates was ultimately a desperate attempt to restore order, even if only temporarily. However, by condemning Socrates, Athens not only failed to solve its internal problems, but ensured that they would be remembered forever. The perceived injustice of his death became a symbol of the tension between the individual and the collective, between critical thought and conformity. His execution revealed an uncomfortable truth. Democracies are not immune to fatal mistakes when governed by fear. Socrates was not just a victim of the politics of his time, he was an eternal reminder that no society is above its own vices. And what if, in that fateful vote, the jury had made a different decision? If Socrates had been acquitted, would he have continued to influence Athens, helping the city navigate its crises through philosophical debate? Or would his survival have diminished the impact of his ideas, which perhaps became so powerful precisely because they were sealed by martyrdom? These questions still echo today, but one thing is certain. By condemning him, Athens may have sacrificed a man, but it created a legacy that it could never control. Was Socrates condemned out of justice or fear of his ideas? His death exposed the fragilities of a society in crisis, but also immortalized the power of critical thinking. If you had been one of the jurors, would you have voted for his condemnation or acquittal? Comment below. And since we're talking about historical trials, did you know that even the story of Atlantis might be a grand lie crafted by Plato? Click on the video next to this one and uncover the truths behind the myth they never told you.